Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Adventure Built. My name is Kelly.
I'm Trevor.
And we're back in the shop doing another install, a brand new suspension on my 2020 Tacoma from IRONMAN 4x4. Stay tuned.
All right, bro, you just put in an iBox suspension. Why are you going with an IRONMAN 4x4 suspension now?
So I really liked the iBox suspension. It is a really good kit. However, there were a couple things that I wouldn't say I was having issues with. I just needed to upgrade, like my upper control arms and my rear springs. And I was able to get hold of IRONMAN 4x4 and they hooked me up with the full kit. So I'm just gonna replace the whole thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I noticed with the iBox, like driving it around when I was able to drive it, he let me drive it. And it has a very comfortable ride around town and everything else. Even like riding with you on some of the trails, it's really not bad. But once you start adding some weight to it, I think that's when it starts to have a little shortcomings and everything on there.
And I really think that has a lot to do with the fact that I set it up at the very top notch, expecting to have a bumper really soon. I never got that bumper in winch mounted, but now we have this. I really like the way the front end drove, but the rear end was where I was having a lot of issues. The rear factory springs had completely flattened out, and it just was a terrible ride. It bounced all over the place. When we did the Arizona BDR, I noticed the back end constantly bottoming out, even with only maybe 600 pounds in the back end of the truck. So very disappointing from Toyota, but we're getting an upgrade.
Yeah, I was really shocked about the OEM leaf springs. Like, I've never seen like springs flatten out like that unless it was on like a massive load. Yeah, but my IRONMAN 4x4 suspension did fantastic on the Arizona BDR, and so that's why we called them, because they have a fantastic suspension and not just bang for the buck, but I think it's one of the best all-around suspensions out there. So we're going to try it out on the Taco.
Trevor went with the Foam Cell Pro kit, and I kind of went a different direction. I went with the Nitro shocks to give those a shot. They're very similar to the iBox shocks, pretty much the exact same technology. So we'll see how they perform.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how they compare.
All right, well, let's get all of this unboxed and get this build started. And here's all the tools you're gonna need to get this job done right. You're gonna need a good floor jack and jack stands, high temperature grease, a couple straps, a block of wood, a crowbar. I used air tools, but you don't have to. You're gonna need a large mallet. I like these ball peen mallets, a dead blow hammer, torque wrench, a pin to help index holes, a slew of deep sockets for your impact, a whole mess of different pliers to be able to bend that metal back to get those long upper control arm bolts out, Allen keys, utility knife, a whole complement of metric sockets, socket wrench, an entire complement of metric wrenches, more pliers, a black Sharpie, a gray Sharpie, a breaker bar, high-speed drill, good high-speed drill bits, and of course work gloves and safety glasses. First things first, we're gonna get the truck up in the air and the front tires off. The next step is to remove the skid plate and the sway bar. first thing we're gonna do is disconnect the ABS lines and the brake lines from the tie rod. We're gonna start with the bolt that connects the ABS sensor line to the upper control arm using a 10mm socket. Next on the tie rod, we're going to disconnect both the main bracket line, and there's also a secondary line that holds the ABS sensor to the tie rod. We're going to disconnect both individually to give us the most amount of flex in this system. The small bolt comes out with a 10mm socket. And now we're going to remove the main bracket, which is a 12mm socket. And now we're going to take the bracket and we're just going to push it out. There's a notch that holds it in place. And now it's free. And we're going to put the bolt right back in. When I did the I-box suspension, I removed the coilover as a full component with the top hat in place. I took it to a shop, had them disassemble it. That process cost me about 2 hours and $60. I did some research and I found a way that you can actually disassemble the coilover while still in the vehicle without having to take it to a shop and use a coil spring compressor. Now, this process is not recommended. I'm doing this at my own risk of possible bodily injury, but I don't want you guys to think that I'm doing this without knowing the risks. However, we did this way on the other side. It worked flawless, so I'm gonna do it on this side. I'm gonna show you guys how I did it, but please, I do not recommend you doing this. Take it to a shop. It really is time and money well spent. I'm just not doing that. The next step is going to be marking the angles and positions of the 4 bolts that hold the lower control arms in place. I have to loosen those bolts to get the most amount of droop to get these shocks out, and this will help me when I'm tightening to get them in place and closer for the alignment. Now, because I'm marking this, the metal is black, the bolt is silver, and I have a silver and black Sharpie. I'm gonna go over the whole thing in black first, making this line really thick. And then I'm gonna take one thin line through the center of it. And now you can see that line over the black with the Sharpie. Now I've got to do that to both sides of both bolts. 3 more times. And now using a breaker bar and a 22mm socket, we're gonna loosen up these lower control arm bolts. And now the other side. Now I'm gonna pull off the cotter pin and loosen the castle nut to the steering arm. I'm just gonna expose 3 or 4 threads, and then I'm gonna tap it so that it drops down, just to make it easier when it comes time to have to remove that a little bit later on. And we're removing the castle nut with a 19mm socket. With our ball peen hammer, we're gonna tap right here, the side of the knuckle, to release it. Just like that. Now I'm gonna bring over the floor jack. I'm gonna position it under the lower control arm. I'm gonna lift it up and compress the lower control arm into the weight of the vehicle to take up some of that pressure. And then I'm gonna loosen and remove the 2 bolts that hold the lower control arm into the steering knuckle. So now that I have all those bolts loose, let me tell you the process. The first step, safety glasses. We're gonna take the floor jack, we're gonna jack it up as far as we can, and then we're gonna remove the very top bolt to the shock. After that's removed, we're gonna remove the 2 bottom bolts off of the lower control arm. We're gonna take the floor jack and we're gonna lower the entire assembly down and release all that pressure in the shock. And we're gonna remove this with a 19mm wrench. The shock is spinning. I'm gonna be using a 5mm wrench on the very top to stop it from spinning. And now I'm going to remove those 2 bolts completely and lower the floor jack to release the pressure on the coil. I've lowered the floor jack as far as it will go, releasing all the pressure that's built into the coil at this point. Now we have to completely remove the top bolt to the shock to allow the shock to drop out between the coil while it's still mounted. So you kind of have to play around with the tension of the floor jack. You don't want to have it all the way off of the bottom of the lower control arm, otherwise the coil is pushing on the shock. You want to have just a little bit of force when you're unscrewing that. But like I said, this actually has a fair level of danger built into it. You really are better off taking it to a shop, pay 60 bucks, a couple hours of your day, avoid an injury. It's way, way safer. But that being said, let's lower the shock and see if this thing just kind of comes right out. Now before I take all the pressure off, I'm going to take a 19mm socket and a 19mm wrench, and I'm going to remove the bottom bolt of the coilover. The shock and the coil are completely free, just got to pull them out. Now we're going to completely remove the upper control arm, but first we have to raise up the lower control arm and press it up against the whole steering assembly. That way it doesn't fall down when I remove the upper control arm from the knuckle. I just threw a strap around this, connected it to the knuckle. That way it doesn't pull on the ABS line or the brake line. Now we're going to use a panel removal tool and take off these plastic cover pieces. That coilover came out really nice and easy. I'm super happy how that ended up. Now this next step is by far the most complicated. It's trying to remove the long bolt out of the upper control arm. It is a huge pain in the ass. On the driver's side, we had to bend sheet metal out of the way. We also had to raise up the body off the frame a couple inches to get the clearance we needed to get that foot-long bolt all the way out. We just got the driver's side upper control arm removed. It was a complete, total pain in the butt. Let me show you kind of step-by-step how we did it. I'm not going to go into all of the details because it's a little bit of a disaster. It was a 2-step process. We basically had to knock in part of the body panel to get the long bolt that goes through this entire upper control arm assembly. So we had to pull out this entire bolt all the way through, and it's almost a foot long. So what we had to do was we had to bend back the body panel to make enough clearance to get that bolt through. And then there still wasn't enough clearance, and we had no other choice but to remove the very front body mount and then the one body mount back, and it's actually my body mount relocate mount. We removed both of those to be able to lift the body off the frame about 1 inch so we could actually beat it out with a rod and a hammer. It was not pretty. I don't know how we're gonna get it back in, but that's how we removed it. So yeah, good luck. This side I think is gonna be a little bit easier. However, there is a coolant line to the AC system that goes right next to it. So we might have to bend that out of the way a little bit. I'm not quite sure how they actually got these in. I'm assuming they put the entire suspension system in when they built these trucks and then laid the body on top when it was done. There's no way the factory put anything in afterwards. And I really don't know what Toyota was thinking when they made the body seam to the body and the fender go right where the upper control arm bolts go through. I think that was some pretty poor engineering, but it's what we have. So we're gonna overcome this issue. We're gonna get this bolt out. We're gonna start with 2 19mm wrenches to get the nut off that long bolt. As you can see right off the bat, that this bolt impacts 1 inch away from where it lives. So now I've got a pair of channel locks, and all I'm gonna do is peel back the sheet metal in order to get this bolt out. So right now I'm just trying to peel that sheet metal back just a little bit, just pressing it out of the way. It's not fun to do on a 2020 Tacoma. However, it has to be done to get that stupid bolt out. I know it's really hard to see in the engine compartment, but it's obviously under a lot of stuff, but that bolt is starting to come out. I think I might be able to pull it out. Be sure you do this when your engine and everything cold. You definitely don't want to be sticking your hand around all of these air conditioning and heating hose components, because you will burn the bejesus out of your arms. So do it when the engine's cold, no other time. It's out. That was a real pain, but it was way easier than the driver's side. Now it's time to remove this upper control arm and get the new one put in, and then try to get this thing in. That is gonna be the challenge, trying to hold that in position while up in the engine compartment, putting this rod back in. When reinstalling, make sure you put this ABS wire over the upper control arm. With some pretty minimal coercing, pounding, whacking, I got the bolt all the way through. Now we gotta tighten it up and get the new IRONMAN coil and shock put in its new home. Now we're gonna reconnect the steering knuckle to the upper control arm. Now I'm gonna lower the floor jack down to give ourselves enough room that we can get the new coil and the new shock in their final home. But I wanted to take a quick second to talk about how the IRONMAN kit compares to the iBot kit and obviously some of the factory parts. So let's start with the coils. Coils are fairly universal. However, the iBot coil has 9 coils and the IRONMAN has 10. And the reason for that is I let IRONMAN know when I was ordering the kit exactly what kind of weight I was gonna have on the front end. So they gave me a little bit heavier duty due to my front bumper and winch that will eventually be going on this truck right here. Now to the front shocks. The front shocks themselves both look really comparable. They're both an oil and nitrogen gas filled shock. The iBox shock is this really nice aluminum finish to it, which I actually really prefer. And the iBox shock, it has 2 different height settings, 2 inches and 2.5 inches. And there's also a setting if you're gonna get a heavier bumper or winch, or basically anything over 150 pounds, they suggest you putting it on the heavier setting. Now the IRONMAN only has 1 position, and then you can add a spacer in here to give yourself a little bit extra lift, which I am gonna be doing because of the 35s, and I'm going to be getting a bumper and a winch very, very shortly. All right, now let's move over to the upper control arms. The upper control arms is where this kit really, really shines. They are obviously a huge improvement over the stock upper control arms. There is one component on these upper control arms that I have to point out that I absolutely wish more companies would do. The ball joints on the IRONMAN 4x4 upper control arm is the exact same one as factory. A lot of aftermarket companies will use a proprietary ball in their upper control arms, which is great. I'm sure they're heavy duty, they last a long time. The problem is that if you're out in the backcountry and you don't have access or cannot wait for mail, these are in any dealership across the country. The last thing you want is to be up in Alaska and have one of these ball joints fail, and then you have to wait for someone to ship you one across the entire country. First things first, we have to do a little pre-assembly of the shock. We're gonna remove this cup for the bottom of the coil, and we're gonna put on the spacer, and that is because I need the extra lift. So we'll put that on, and it just slides over the notch. I'm gonna put the cup back on, slide it over. Now to install the boot. Now we just take our zip tie, put the zip tie on it, make sure that the top of the tube is within that first notch of the rubber. Put the zip tie on nice and tight. Trim the excess. Ready to go on the vehicle. So installing the coil, flat part goes up, round part goes down. All right, so we got that lower shock bolt in. Now we need to raise it up a little bit and finagle that top bolt through the top hat. You want to make sure the coil is just off the bucket so it doesn't squeak. And now we're going to have our helper jack up the floor jack while we align the shock to go in the hole. All right, big guy, you want to check that up? Just go slow. All right, so now we're going to put the rubber bushing on, the top hat, and then the bolt. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to torque down the upper control arms, and then I'm going to beat down the panel that I had to pull out, and I'm going to straighten everything out, that way it looks nice and clean. The torque spec for the long bolt that goes through the A-arm is 85 foot-pounds. However, we're not going to be able to get a torque wrench in there because there's a brake line on one side and another coolant line on the other side, and I don't want to bend those lines out of the way just to get a torque wrench in there. We are going to give the best 85 foot-pound estimation with the standard wrench. I'm pretty sure I nailed that one. So now I'm going to take a hammer and fix the damage I caused to the body panel by pulling it out. I'm just going to massage it back in place with a mallet. Now that looks way better for inside of the fender well. We have to do one more actual modification to one of the brackets. The top bracket that goes on the A-arm, it's a different size bolt that connects the bracket to the actual A-arm itself for the ABS line. I'm gonna remount that hole with a 5/16 drill bit. So there's one more thing we have to do to that bracket to make it fit. The actual A-arm width is wider than what the factory A-arm was, so that bracket is kind of narrow. We have to take a pair of pliers and open that bracket up a little bit to make it fit over the new IRONMAN upper control arm. Now we've got the bracket bent the way we want it. This is the 5mm Allen bolt that secures the bracket into the IRONMAN upper control arm. And this gets torqued down to 9 foot-pounds, which is basically hand tight. We're moving on to the castle nut. 19mm socket to tighten it, 81 foot-pounds to torque it. And don't forget the cotter pin. Time to reattach the ABS line and the brake line. They both get torqued to 9 pounds, so basically just hand tight, and also the mud flaps to the back of the fenders. 12mm socket. And this gets tightened down with a 10mm socket and torqued to 9 foot-pounds. The bottom shock gets torqued to 61 foot-pounds with a 19mm socket. Reinstall the 2 bolts that go in underneath the lower control arm into the steering knuckle, 118 foot-pounds with a 19mm socket. The The very last thing before we reconnect the sway bar, we have to align and tighten down the lower control arms. They get tightened down with a 22mm socket, a 22mm wrench, down to 100 foot-pounds. Remember to make sure both your alignment marks are aligned and then tighten it down. Now let's do the other side. The entire system has been torqued, and I do suggest going back and just re-torque everything. You can never be too careful. Remember, this is your truck, it's your suspension. Make sure it's spot on. Now it's time to reinstall the sway bar. Remember, the only reason I disconnected it is really just ease of video. I thought maybe I might run without it, but honestly, there's so much body roll, it's just not worth it. So I'm reinstalling it. Let's do it right now. The only part of the IBOT kit that I'm going to be reusing are the sway bar spacers. The IRONMAN kit didn't come with them for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. I don't know if their shocks don't need that clearance. Since the shocks are the same diameter as the IBOT, I'm pretty sure you're going to need that clearance, so I'm going to reuse them. To install the blocks, you orient the aftermarket hole to the front, the stock hole this way, and all you're going to do is put these into using the stock hardware. They go back into the frame. All right, let's do the other side. And the sway bar gets torqued down to 52 foot-pounds with a 17mm socket. And 30 foot-pounds into the frame. All we gotta do is put on the front skid plate and the front end's done. The kit's looking really good. I'm gonna throw the tires back on, flip it around, work on the back end. Last week when we finished up section 7 of the Arizona BDR, I noticed there was a weird bottoming out, and I noticed it for a while, but I didn't pay much attention to it, but there's a bottoming out in the rear end of my truck. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I thought the back may have been a little bit overweighted, but I really didn't have a lot of stuff on there. I had some cooking gear, some camp gear, and my rooftop tent on top. So maybe 700 pounds in the back of my truck. When I looked at my leaf springs, they were completely flat. And I figured that's why they kept bottoming out. They completely lost all curvature. I don't even know how that could happen. I've never seen that before on any truck that I've owned, but it happened. Luckily, the IRONMAN 4x4 kit comes with heavy duty leaf springs, so this should never be an issue again. I've already got the rear end lifted up, the tires off, so step 1 is going to be removing the shocks. With the 12mm socket, we're gonna remove the brake line from the leaf spring. Now I'm going to remove both U-bolts from the leaf springs. Now I'm gonna lower the floor jack to relieve some of the pressure off the leaf springs, and then using a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket, I'm gonna start loosening the leaf spring to pull it out. So you can see that the shackle is kind of reversed what you would normally see on a truck. However, the bolt comes out on that side, so you actually have to either pull this out and lean this whole thing forward, or pull it off from the bottom and remove it completely. I'm gonna try pulling the front bolt out of the leaf spring to see if it will angle forward and I'm able to get that bolt out. I got the forwardmost bolt out of the leaf spring. However, it's still not articulating forward enough for me to get the top bolt out. So I'm gonna have to loosen up the bottom bolt, and hopefully that will allow it to kind of fall forward for me to pull that top bolt out. Fingers crossed. Well, it looks like the tire is impacting where the bolt has to come out. So now I have to drop the spare tire down to give myself the clearance I need to get that bolt out. I want to take a quick second to talk about the difference between the IRONMAN leaf springs and the stock leaf springs. As you can tell, there is a huge difference between the two packs. The IRONMAN leaf springs are obviously a lot more sturdy and a lot more firm. When my truck is empty, which is pretty rare, it might be a little bit stiffer ride, but it's completely worth it, especially when I build out my drawer system. The IRONMAN 4x4 does require a little bit of assembly. You have to insert the polyurethane bushings on the ends of the leaf springs. With a little help of some high temperature grease, we'll get them in, no problem. It is time for the leaf springs to go back in. They're not crazy heavy, but they're just an awkward weight, and there definitely is some weight to them. I'm gonna come in over the axle, back to front, and try to get around that brake line without dropping the leaf spring on that brake line. That would be terrible. As you can see, I needed to get a little bit more droop to get these down closer to the perch. I got it in there. One thing you wanna make sure though is that these brake lines here do not get overextended. This is probably as far as I can go down. It's pretty taut, but not a hard angle. So that's as far in the droop that I can go. Now I have to manhandle them into position and get some bolts in. I can't get the leaf spring to align properly, so I pulled off the very back shackle here, hoping that I can insert this into the back hole and then put this into its home. We'll see if it works. So that side is in, both bolts are in there hand tight. Now I'm working on the front bolt still. This thing is actually quite a pain to get in there. To get all three holes lined up with this thing moving around quite a bit, definitely not easy. I would definitely suggest a two-person job. One person to kind of stabilize everything, the other person line the holes up. It would make it go a lot easier. So right now I've got the front of the leaf spring pretty close. I need to line it up a little bit more, and I'm gonna keep on trucking. So like I said, having a really hard time lining these holes up. One person doing it, two-person job. Now I'm using a larger pin to index that hole, and I'm trying to use a dead blow mallet to help align it, but it wants to bounce over and under it and over it and under it and over it and under it, so we'll see what happens. I've got the bolt through, it's just not through all the way. I have to twist the leaf spring, push it through, and that will be that. The leaf spring is in, everything is nice and tight. Now we're gonna put the U-bolts on and attach the brake line to the leaf spring. And tighten it down with a 22mm socket. And it gets torqued down to 52 foot-pounds. We're going to reinstall this bolt for the brake line into the leaf pack with a 12mm socket. So the stock bolt that holds the brake line against the leaf pack actually works in that hole. It may not look like it will. If you put the bolt on straight, push on it, and force it in, it goes right in. I think the beginning of the hole when I was first trying to put it in was a little gunked up, so I had to push through that. Once you get past it, it went right in. It is finally time to install the shock. You have 3 washers they go to the shock. You have a thick washer, another thick washer, and then you have this thinner indexing washer with the nipple. Then you have a bushing with an indexing nipple and a flat bushing. So this is the way it builds out on the shock. First, you put down the thick washer, your flat bushing, your indexing washer with the nipple. Once it goes into the seating position on the mount, then you put the indexing washer with the nipple down, flat washer on top, and then your nylock nut. Because I have the nitrogen gas-filled shocks, these are under pressure. As soon as I cut this strap, it's going to expand and it's going to take a lot of force to rebound that preload. To make the install a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually install the bottom bushing onto the mount, and then I'm going to cut the strap. I'm going to build the spacers and bushings before it actually reaches the top mount, and hopefully I'll be able to make it before it gets pushed in. Alright, so here's the tricky part. I've got it already. I've got my stack pre-built, thick washer, flat bushing, indexing bushing, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the strap, pull this protective cover off, slip this on before it gets up into this hole right here. Now I'm going to install the rubber bushing with the indexing nipple on it and the other thick washer. And now the nylock nut. And tighten it down with a 19mm wrench. And when it starts to spin, you can use a 7mm wrench or a 1/4 inch wrench in case you lose your metric one, just like I did. We're going to tighten down this bottom bolt, 17mm wrench. Alright, that's good and tight. Everything is put in, everything is tight, and it looks amazing. I am so happy with how this looks and how it turned out. I'll admit it was a lot of work. It's a super hot day. It's like 105 here in Phoenix, and I've been in the garage all day long doing this, but it was 100% worth it. I would do it again in an instant, especially because I leave for Colorado tomorrow with my youngest son. We're doing a week-long trip in Colorado, and I have no doubt the suspension is going to perform flawless. The build is finally in and complete. I took it for a test drive and it drives amazing. I hate to say it, but it actually drives a little bit better than my Eibach, even though they're similar designed shock. And obviously with the IRONMAN upper control arms and the little bit higher compression coilovers, it rides really nice up front, and it is a dream in the rear with these new leaf packs. I could not be more happy with the IRONMAN. I will definitely keep you guys updated on how the IRONMAN 4x4 suspension kit performs in Colorado. Alright guys, I hope you liked this video. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, be sure to like, be sure to subscribe. We'll see you guys next time.